"You are not meant here." Isabella Frost's voice rang out clearly through the first-class cabin like a bell. She stood in the aisle of the aircraft, her red silk blouse open to the bright overhead lights, manicured finger pointing down at Samuel Beckett's seat. "Sir, the flight attendant must know that this man is not traveling first class. People of his ilk would not come up here." The sunlight, streaming through the cabin windows, hit her diamond bracelet as she waved her hand. "I insist that you shift him to the coach where he really belongs before we lift off." The other passengers were glancing and some nodding their heads, while Samuel Beckett was sitting quietly in his pressed green polo shirt and dark slacks. To those who know what to look for, he had a military bearing. Isabella Frost had no idea that the inappropriate passenger she was humiliating had put his life at risk for the very freedoms that allowed her to speak so carelessly. Welcome to Frost Folktales. This is where we tell the stories of those who were underestimated, dismissed, and targeted, yet chose courage over silence. If these stories move you, subscribe and be part of a community that refuses to let them fade into the background. Samuel Beckett entered the airplane with the same quiet confidence he had acquired through 3 decades of military service. At the age of 62, with graying temples and clenched hands the size of a fist, his sacrifice would be something which most person would not understand. The man settled into seat 2A with his boarding pass placed properly and placed his small carry-on bag under the seat. His movements appeared to belong to a person of order and discipline. As the cabin lit up, his face became clear while he gazed out the window. Perhaps he was thinking about last week's Medal of Honor ceremony, during which he honored lost comrades who could not make this journey again. But Isabella Frost did not see any of this dignity. She could only see what her bigoted mind allowed her. "Ma'am, I understand your concern," said Flight Attendant Samantha Howe, gracefully dressed in navy blue uniform and on screen. "All first-class passengers, however, hold valid tickets." She looked nervously between Isabella Frost's imperious stare and Samuel Beckett's calm face. She was caught between the two and the pressure of an aggressively demanding passenger. "Don't you mom me," Isabella said, brushing against Samantha and moving close to her in red silk. The natural light from the cabin window's prismatic reflected in her diamond earrings that only added to her cold nature. "I'm in first class twice a month for business. I know who belongs here. Check him out." She pointed at Samuel with open disdain. "That is certainly not a first-class passenger. You don't seem to understand airline etiquette or dress codes. Therefore, I shouldn't have to share a cabin with you." Almost without my noticing, Samuel Beckett's jaw tightened, but he stayed seated, hands calmly folded in his lap. Those hands had once pulled injured soldiers from flaming vehicles under enemy attack. They had signed accolades for numerous airmen who served with distinction. They paid their respects at more military funerals with a salute than any hands deserved. Now they were simply resting when a stranger questioned his right to sit in that seat which he had duly purchased. The sound inside the cabin had gotten a bit eerily quiet, with the sole noise coming from the air conditioner. Curiously, some of the other passengers turned their heads to watch, one appearing overwhelmed, winded. There was an elderly woman in dark blue jacket, 3 rows back. She was shaking her head disapprovingly. It was not clear whether she was doing this because of Isabella or because Samuel was here. "Miss," Isabella Frost corrected sharply, her voice carrying the entitled tone of someone unaccustomed to being questioned. "Isabella Frost, my family has significant business relationships with this airline, and I will not tolerate this kind of mix-up." She pulled out her phone with theatrical flourish, her red manicured nails clicking against the screen. "I have direct contacts with airline management, and they will want to know about passengers fraudulently using tickets they're not authorized to have." Samantha Howe's discomfort became more pronounced as she realized the situation was escalating beyond her training parameters. The bright cabin lighting seemed to intensify the awkwardness of the moment. making every gesture and expression visible to the growing audience of passengers. "Ma'am, Miss Frost," she corrected herself quickly. "All passengers go through proper security and ticketing procedures. If someone is seated in first class, their documentation has been verified multiple times throughout the boarding process. Then your system has failed," Isabella declared with absolute certainty, her diamond bracelet catching the light as she gestured emphatically. "Because there has clearly been an error here. People like him," she paused meaningfully, letting the implication hang in the air like poison gas, "don't typically have the means or background for first-class travel. I'm doing you a favor by pointing out this obvious mistake before it becomes a bigger problem." The words hit Samuel Beckett like physical blows, each assumption cutting deeper than the last. He had commanded airbases with budgets exceeding millions of dollars. He had briefed senators and cabinet members on national security matters. He had stood in the Oval Office receiving commendations from presidents of both political parties. Yet here sat a woman who looked at his skin color and immediately concluded he was unworthy of basic respect, let alone first-class accommodations. A businessman in an orange shirt and blue jacket, seated across the aisle, leaned forward slightly, his expression troubled by what he was witnessing. Behind him, a middle-aged woman in a green top shifted uncomfortably, clearly disturbed by Isabella's increasingly bold statements. The tension was becoming palpable as passengers processed the ugly reality of what was occurring in their shared space. "Look," Isabella continued, her voice taking on a patronizing tone that made several passengers visibly wince. "I'm not trying to be difficult here. I'm simply pointing out an obvious error that needs correction." She smoothed her red silk blouse with practiced authority, every gesture reinforcing her sense of superiority. This gentleman, she emphasized the word mockingly, would probably be much more comfortable in coach with passengers more suited to his background and circumstances. "Everyone wins when people fly in their appropriate sections." Samuel Beckett finally spoke, his voice reflecting the measured cadence of command authority of decades of diplomatic restraint. "I have my boarding pass and ID ready in case the cabin crew needs to check it, ma'am." A slight burn was there inside him, but with his words, he was clear and respectful. "I acquired this ticket the proper way, and I am well within my rights to be here." But Isabella Frost was quite beyond reason. The woman's prejudice had fully taken over as a routine check had turned into a public display of ignorance and entitlement. "Oh, please," she laughed, the sound so ugly that it echoed in the small space. "I'm sure you have some kind of document. The question is whether this is an actual passport or an imposter, supported by theft. I've witnessed such events before, and it is imperative that the airlines safeguard their premium passengers from security threats." The fraud allegation forced several passengers out of their comfort zone. The senior citizen on the blue jacket and the businessman on the orange shirt and blue jacket shook his head at the sight. However, none spoke up, torn between their unease about the situation and their unwillingness to get involved in an ugly scene. Samantha Howe understood she was losing grip on everything altogether. Although her training had discussed difficult passengers, nothing had prepared her for handling someone whose entitlement knew no bounds. "Miss Frost," she said hesitantly, "I can certainly verify your documentation if you want, but I want to assure you that our boarding procedure is quite complete. All first-class passengers have cleared through security and ticketing successfully." "Then verify it," Isabella demanded triumphantly, sensing victory within her grasp. "Check his identification, run his credit card, do whatever you need to do to confirm this ticket wasn't obtained fraudulently, because I guarantee you that when you investigate properly, you'll find irregularities." Her diamond earrings caught the bright cabin lighting as she nodded confidently, absolutely certain that her assumptions would be validated. Samuel Beckett reached into his jacket pocket with the same deliberate precision he had once used to retrieve classified briefing materials in situation rooms around the world. His boarding pass and military identification were organized exactly as they had been throughout his career, ready for inspection by anyone with legitimate authority to request them. But as he prepared to comply with yet another humiliating demand, something inside him wondered how many more times he would be forced to prove his worth to people who would never question their own right to exist in spaces they considered their domain. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reveal far more about character, honor, and the true meaning of service than anyone aboard that aircraft could possibly anticipate. Isabella Frost stood confident in her prejudiced assumptions, having no idea that she was about to discover just how wrong entitled ignorance could be when confronted with genuine American heroism. As Isabella Frost moved closer to Samuel Beckett's table, her red silk blouse caught in the overhead fluorescent light, and her diamante bracelet flashed as she spoke. Her voice was raised enough for the whole first-class cabin to hear her. Seemingly, she was enjoying their attention as her outburst was developing. "Do you want me to say that again?" Isabella said while pointing her manicured finger at Samuel. "I won't sit next to that man in first class for 6 hours. Do you know who I am?" Samantha Howe fidgeted in her short-sleeved navy blue flight attendant uniform as Isabella's requests put pressure on the flight attendant's smile. The natural light from the sky that streams through the plane window shows the anxiety on her face as she alternates glances between them. Samuel Beckett was sitting quietly in a green polo and dark slacks with hands folded on his lap. Even though he was being publicly humiliated, he held himself firmly and breathed evenly. He had experience with worse things than what an entitled woman was doing. However, not many were as degrading as this one. "Please lower your voice, ma'am." Samantha started off hesitantly but was immediately stopped by a hand wave from Isabella. "Lower my voice? Are you really asking me to lower my voice with a situation like this in first class?" Isabella asked indignantly. "I paid for my ticket, full price, and I expect to be sitting next to passengers who actually belong here, not some affirmative action dude or charity handout who doesn't even know how to behave in his own seat." It was clear from her statements that she is a racist. Various people on board turned back to look, some with disbelief and others with agreement. The mixed reactions created an awkward tension that appeared to fuel Isabella's sense of being right. Victor Liang, a businessman dressed in an orange dress shirt and a blue jacket, seated across the aisle, and whom I saw frown at his laptop. The man's expensive suit and confident demeanor implied that he was used to flying first class. However, his expression of disgust suggested that he had never witnessed such overt prejudice. "This is totally unacceptable," Victor muttered loudly enough for those near him to hear. "The guy is just sitting and minding his own business." Isabella turned to him angrily, narrowly avoiding messing up her perfectly styled hair. "What's your problem? I wasn't talking to you. Unless you're also not cool with the airline's evident lack of standards for first-class passengers, this doesn't concern you." The elderly woman in a blue jacket who was sitting near the window tightened her grip on the purse as she saw Beatrice Nolan challenged. Her hands trembled as she watched with great sadness the things happening in reality. They looked ungainly like a rag, but whether old age caused the trembling or the public cruelty or anything else was very difficult to say. "Now look here, young lady," said Beatrice tremblingly but determinedly. "There's no call for speaking to people that way." Isabella's eyes flickered with annoyance, recognizing the cabin was becoming divided yet again. Instead of shirking the opposition, she appeared to thrive upon it, like their counter-argument proved her point about the deteriorating quality of air travel. Isabella scolded Beatrice, saying not to call her a young lady while arguing for the experience they all paid for. "When I book first class, I expect first-class passengers, not charity cases or people who clearly never been at the front of the plane before." Then she went back to Samantha, who was trying to figure out how to manage this escalated situation. The flight attendant's training readied her for difficult passengers, but she was rarely met with such overt racism, delivered with such a sense of entitlement. "I'm going to make this very simple for you," Isabella continued, her voice taking on a threatening tone. "My husband is Douglas Frost of Frost Industries. We have platinum status with this airline and personal relationships with executives at the corporate level. If this situation isn't resolved immediately, I will be making phone calls before we even take off." She pulled out her designer phone, waving it like a weapon. "I have my lawyer on speed dial, and trust me, he's very good at handling discrimination cases. Though in this instance, it would be discrimination against paying customers who are being forced to endure substandard conditions." Samuel continued to sit quietly, though a muscle in his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He had commanded respect from generals and world leaders, had been decorated for heroism under fire. Yet here he sat, enduring the most degrading treatment he had experienced in decades. Samantha felt pressure from all around her. Isabella's threats about her corporate connections and going to lawyers sounded reasonable, especially given her expensive clothing. Flight attendant was an up-in-air job for her at that moment in time. "Sir," Samantha said hesitantly, calling Samuel sir for the first time, "I will need your boarding pass and identification to ensure things are in order." The request landed in the air like a slap. Many passengers gasped when it was implied that Samuel had to be verified, but not Isabella. Victor Liang slammed his laptop shut as disgust rolled off of him. Samuel reached into his pocket with deliberate calm, producing his boarding pass and identification without protest or complaint. His movements were precise, controlled, betraying none of the humiliation he must have felt at being singled out for documentation that no other passenger had been asked to provide. "Thank you, sir," Samantha said quietly as she examined the documents. Everything was clearly in order. First-class seat, proper identification, legitimate ticket. She felt a wave of shame wash over her for even asking, but Isabella's threats echoed in her mind. "Well?" Isabella demanded, tapping her foot impatiently. "I assume you've discovered what we all already knew. That ticket is either fake, stolen, or purchased through some kind of fraudulent means. People like him simply don't fly first class on legitimate tickets." Samantha's hands trembled slightly as she held the perfectly valid documentation. "Ma'am, everything appears to be in order with this gentleman's ticket." Isabella's face flushed red, clashing with her silk blouse. Rather than accepting the evidence, she doubled down on her accusations with even more vehemence. "Oh, please, anyone can fake a boarding pass these days. Have you seen the news about airline fraud? People steal credit card information, hack reservation systems, use stolen identities. Just because he has papers doesn't mean they're legitimate." She waved Samuel off with a louder, more confident voice, as if the more she said it, the more it became true. "Look at him. Does he look like he takes the first class often? Does he look like he belongs here with us? His clothes, his look, everything about him shows that he is not supposed to be here." Everyone in the cabin had fallen silent, except for Isabella, whose voice ricocheted off the walls. Other passengers were now staring at the scene, their conversations having come to a halt. "Moreover, it seems highly suspicious to me that he has said nothing in his own defense. A proper passenger would be outraged to be asked any of this. His silence amounts to an admission of guilt as far as I am concerned." His persistent calmness appeared to annoy her. She expected a rage, a defensiveness, something to show the truth of what she said. As he retained his quiet dignity, she looked more unreasonable. Samantha stated, "Ma'am, I'm really sorry, but could you please keep your voice down further? People in the economy can probably hear you. We have other guests who are preparing to leave for their travel." Isabella responded sharply, "Don't ask me to bring my voice down when you're the one who's not addressing a real safety issue. I won't let this go. Move him to economy where he belongs, or transfer me to a different part of first class where I don't have to deal with this rubbish." The unnecessary battle carried on as other passengers witnessed reactively. Some appeared to stand behind Isabella and nod in agreement on proper first-class standards, while others looked disgusted by her. They opted to keep mum as they didn't want to get involved in the ugly spat. Victor Liang finally curtly spoke up again, sounding like someone who negotiates in the boardroom. "This has gone on far too long. The man has shown his documentation and is bothering no one. You are the only one to disturb this cabin." With renewed fury, Isabella fired him a look. "How dare you side against a fellow first-class passenger? We are all supposed to uphold standards, not empower the airline's erroneous seating arrangement." Isabella's voice echoed across the entire airplane, and things were clearly out of control. Her requests changed from asking for a change of seat to claiming that the documentation was forged and that the airline was incompetent. The confrontation reached its peak, with half the passengers choosing sides, and Samantha looking very desperate when footsteps could be heard coming from the cockpit area. The person with authority was finally arriving to save first class from their prejudice and fight over privilege. The cockpit door opened with a soft mechanical click, and Captain Christopher Vance stepped into the first-class cabin. His navy blue pilot's uniform was immaculate, complete with 4 gold stripes on his sleeves and wings pinned precisely above his left breast pocket. The overhead fluorescent lighting caught the polished silver of his captain's bars as he moved with the confident stride of someone accustomed to command. At 45, his weathered face bore the subtle marks of years spent navigating both aircraft and difficult situations, and his keen gray eyes immediately began assessing the tension that hung thick in the cabin air. Every conversation ceased. Passengers who had been whispering and craning their necks suddenly found themselves straightening in their seats, instinctively responding to the presence of authority. Even the ambient noise of the aircraft seemed to quiet as Captain Vance's presence commanded the space with effortless professionalism. Isabella Frost's face lit up with triumphant satisfaction. Finally, someone with real power had arrived. Someone who would surely see the situation her way and restore proper order to first class. She smoothed her red silk blouse and adjusted her diamond necklace, preparing to present her case to this new ally. Her confidence surged as she took in the captain's authoritative bearing and distinguished appearance. "Captain, thank goodness you're here," Isabella began, her voice dripping with relief and manufactured distress. "I've been trying to resolve this situation for several minutes now, but your flight attendant seems unable to handle it properly." She gestured dismissively toward Samantha Howe, who stood nearby looking increasingly uncomfortable with each passing moment. Samuel Beckett remained seated calmly in 2A, his hands folded in his lap over his dark slacks. His green polo shirt showed no wrinkles despite the stress of the situation, and his posture remained upright and composed. He watched Captain Vance with quiet interest, neither defensive nor aggressive, simply observing with the patience of someone who had weathered far more serious storms than this one. Captain Vance nodded politely to Isabella Frost but didn't immediately respond to her complaints. Instead, his experienced eyes swept the cabin, taking in the body language of every passenger, the tension in Samantha's shoulders, and the remarkable calm emanating from the man in 2A. Years of military service before his commercial aviation career had taught him to read situations quickly and thoroughly. "Captain, this man," Isabella continued, pointing directly at Samuel Beckett with a manicured finger, "is clearly sitting in the wrong section. I don't know how he managed to get a first-class boarding pass, but people like him simply don't belong here. I've traveled with this airline for over 15 years, and I've never encountered such a blatant case of someone trying to upgrade themselves illegally." The other first-class passengers watched with rapt attention. Victor Liang shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly troubled by Isabella's words, but uncertain how to intervene. Beatrice Nolan, the elderly woman in 1B, clutched her blue jacket tighter and shook her head in dismay at Isabella's audacity. Elena Castillo, seated across the aisle, felt her stomach churn as she recognized the ugly prejudice behind Isabella's complaints. Captain Vance listened to Isabella's tirade without interruption, his expression remaining professionally neutral. When she finally paused for breath, He spoke in a measured tone that carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being heard the first time. "Ma'am, I understand you have concerns about seating arrangements," he said diplomatically. "I'd like to review the situation personally to ensure everything is handled appropriately." His voice carried no hint of whether he agreed or disagreed with her position, which only fueled Isabella's confidence that he would side with her once he understood the full scope of the problem. "Exactly," Isabella said, practically beaming with satisfaction. "I knew someone with your level of authority would understand the situation immediately. This is precisely why I requested management intervention." Captain Vance turned his attention to Samuel Beckett, approaching with the same professional demeanor he'd shown Isabella. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass and identification, please?" Samuel Beckett reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew his documents without any sign of irritation or defensiveness. His movements were economical and precise, and Captain Vance found himself noting the military-like efficiency of the gesture. There was something familiar in the way Samuel carried himself, something that triggered recognition in the back of the captain's mind. "Of course, Captain," Samuel replied, his voice steady and respectful. As he handed over the documents, Captain Vance noticed the firm handshake and direct eye contact. These weren't the actions of someone trying to deceive or hide something. If anything, they spoke to a man comfortable with scrutiny and accustomed to dealing with authority figures as equals. Captain Vance examined the boarding pass first. Seat 2A, first class, properly issued and validated. The name matched the identification perfectly, Samuel Beckett. But as he looked more closely at the military ID that Samuel had included with his driver's license, something made him pause. The captain's own military background, 10 years in the Air Force before transitioning to commercial aviation, had given him an eye for details that civilian pilots might miss. Isabella Frost tapped her foot impatiently, her red high heels clicking against the aircraft floor. "Captain, surely you can see that something isn't right here. I mean, just look at him. Does he honestly seem like the type of person who belongs in first class? I'm not trying to be difficult, but we both know there are standards to maintain." But Captain Vance wasn't listening to Isabella anymore. Something about Samuel's bearing had caught his attention completely. The way he sat at perfect attention without appearing stiff, the way his eyes tracked movement in the cabin with the systematic awareness of someone trained in situational assessment. The subtle signs were there for anyone who knew how to read them, and Captain Vance's military experience was telling him there was much more to this quiet man than Isabella Frost could possibly imagine. As Captain Vance continued examining the identification, he noticed additional details. The military ID wasn't just any military ID. The rank designation made his eyebrows raise slightly, though he maintained his professional composure. This wasn't some junior enlisted man or even a mid-level officer. The documentation suggested someone who had achieved significant rank and responsibility during his service career. "Sir," Captain Vance said quietly, his tone shifting almost imperceptibly from routine inquiry to something approaching respect, "may I ask about your military service?" Samuel Beckett's eyes met the captain's directly. In that moment, a silent communication passed between two veterans, a recognition that transcended rank or branch of service. "Air Force Captain, 32 years of service before retirement." The words were spoken simply, without boasting or elaboration, but they hit Captain Vance like a physical blow. 32 years of service. That wasn't someone who had served a single enlistment and gotten out. That was a career military man, someone who had dedicated his entire adult life to serving his country, someone who had likely seen combat, made life and death decisions, and carried responsibilities that most civilians could never imagine. Isabella Frost's impatience reached a breaking point. "Captain, I don't understand why we're having a social conversation when the solution is so obvious. This man needs to be moved to his proper seat in economy class so that legitimate first-class passengers can board without this disruption. I have a very important business meeting in Seattle, and I cannot afford any delays." Captain Vance looked up from the documents, and for the first time since entering the cabin, his professional mask slipped slightly. There was a hardness in his eyes as he glanced at Isabella, a look that spoke to growing anger carefully held in check. Then he turned back to Samuel Beckett, and his expression softened with what could only be described as dawning respect. 32 years, Captain Vance repeated, more to himself than anyone else. He had served 10 years and considered it a significant chapter of his life. He couldn't imagine 3 decades of military service, the sacrifices that would require, the dedication it would demand. "That's a remarkable career of service, sir." Samuel Beckett nodded modestly. "It was an honor to serve, Captain." The simple dignity of the response, delivered without fanfare or self-promotion, struck Captain Vance profoundly. Here was a man who had given the majority of his adult life to protecting his country, sitting quietly and enduring public humiliation without once raising his voice or demanding the respect he had clearly earned through decades of service. Isabella Frost sensed that the conversation was moving away from her desired outcome, and her voice took on a sharper edge. "Captain, I'm sure this man's military service is very nice, but that doesn't change the fact that he's sitting in my section of the aircraft. I specifically chose this seat, and I shouldn't have to share first class with people who clearly don't understand the expectations that come with premium travel." But Captain Vance was no longer listening to Isabella Frost's complaints. His attention had shifted entirely to Samuel Beckett, and questions were forming in his mind. Questions about what kind of service merited 32 years of commitment. Questions about what rank someone might achieve in such a career. Questions about whether there might be more to this quiet, dignified man's story than even his impressive length of service suggested. The cabin had fallen unusually quiet, with every passenger sensing that something significant was happening, even if they couldn't quite identify what had changed. The power dynamic that had seemed so clearly in Isabella Frost's favor just minutes earlier was shifting in ways that she couldn't yet comprehend, but that Captain Vance was beginning to understand with growing clarity. As the captain continued studying Samuel Beckett's identification and military credentials, his expression continued to evolve from routine professionalism towards something much deeper, something that suggested recognition of not just a fellow veteran, but perhaps someone whose service had been truly exceptional. The implications of what he was discovering would soon transform this entire situation in ways that Isabella Frost could never have anticipated. Captain Christopher Vance stood in the bright first-class cabin, the overhead fluorescent lights illuminating his Navy pilot's uniform with its crisp long sleeves and gleaming captain's bars. His trained eyes moved between Isabella Frost in her red silk blouse and Samuel Beckett in his green polo shirt. But something about the older black man's bearing caught his attention immediately. There was something familiar in the way Samuel sat, something that spoke to Christopher's own military background. Isabella tapped her diamond-adorned fingers impatiently against her armrest, her voice sharp with entitled frustration. "Captain, I've been waiting for someone with actual authority to handle this situation. This man clearly doesn't belong in first class, and your flight attendant has been completely ineffective in resolving this obvious mistake." Christopher held up a hand politely, his eyes never leaving Samuel's face. There was something in the older man's posture, the way he held his shoulders, the quiet dignity in his eyes that Christopher recognized from his own years in the Air Force before transitioning to commercial aviation. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass and identification?" Samuel reached into his jacket pocket with measured movements, extracting his documents without a word. As he handed them over, Christopher caught a glimpse of something else in the wallet, a flash of military identification that made his pulse quicken. The boarding pass clearly showed Samuel's assigned seat, 2A, purchased at full fare 3 weeks prior. "Thank you," Christopher said, but instead of immediately returning the documents, he studied Samuel's face more carefully. "Sir, forgive me for asking, But did you serve? Samuel's eyes met the captain's. And for the first time since this ordeal began, Christopher saw a flicker of connection. Yes, I did. 32 years Air Force. Isabella's voice cut through their quiet exchange like a knife. Excuse me, Captain, but I don't understand why you're having a social conversation with someone who clearly obtained their ticket through fraudulent means. I have connections throughout this airline, and I can assure you that your handling of this situation will be reported to the highest levels. Christopher felt his jaw tighten, but he kept his focus on Samuel. Something about this man's bearing, his calm under pressure, spoke of experiences far beyond what most people could imagine. What was your final rank, if you don't mind me asking? General. Brigadier General Samuel Beckett, retired. Samuel's voice remained steady, but Christopher caught the slight emphasis on his rank, as if Samuel was finally allowing himself to acknowledge what Isabella Frost had tried so hard to diminish. The words hit Christopher like a physical blow. He had just watched a retired Air Force general, a man who had dedicated his life to serving his country, sit quietly while being humiliated by an entitled passenger who couldn't see past the color of his skin. Christopher's own military service, though brief compared to Samuel's career, had taught him about respect, honor, and the sacrifices made by those who wore the uniform. General, Christopher said quietly, his voice carrying a weight of respect that hadn't been there moments before. I'm honored to have you aboard today. Isabella's face flushed red, matching her silk blouse. Captain, I don't know what game you're playing here, but I demand immediate action. I've been patient long enough with this charade. Remove this man from first class immediately, or I'll be forced to contact my attorney and file complaints with every regulatory agency I can think of. Christopher's training in conflict resolution warred with his growing anger at the woman's persistent disrespect. Here was a man who had likely commanded thousands of airmen, who had probably made decisions that affected national security, sitting quietly while being berated by someone whose greatest accomplishment appeared to be marrying wealth. Ma'am, I need you to lower your voice, Christopher said firmly. I'm conducting an investigation into this matter, and I need to gather all the facts. He turned back to Samuel, his voice dropping to a more private tone. General, forgive me for asking, but do you have your military ID with you? I'd like to verify something. Samuel nodded slowly, reaching back into his wallet. Christopher noticed the slight tremor in the older man's hands. Whether from age or the stress of the situation, he couldn't tell. When Samuel produced his retired military identification, Christopher felt his breath catch in his throat. The ID clearly showed Samuel's rank and service dates, but it was the small ribbon representation visible on the card that made Christopher's heart race. Among the various service ribbons was one that Christopher had only seen a handful of times in his military career. The distinctive light blue ribbon with white stars of the Medal of Honor. Christopher's entire worldview shifted in that moment. He wasn't just looking at a retired general, he was looking at one of the nation's highest decorated heroes, a man whose actions had been deemed so extraordinary, so far above and beyond the call of duty, that he had received the military's most prestigious award. The number of living Medal of Honor recipients could be counted in the hundreds, making Samuel Beckett not just a veteran, but a living piece of American military history. Sweet Jesus, Christopher whispered, the words escaping before he could stop them. His military bearing took over as he straightened to attention. General, I had no idea. The Medal of Honor. Samuel nodded once, a slight smile crossing his features for the first time since boarding. Afghanistan, 2010. But that was a long time ago, son. Isabella's voice rose to near shrieking levels. Captain Vance, I can see your name tag, and I want you to know that I'm memorizing every detail of this interaction. Your failure to address this situation is completely unacceptable. I fly first class regularly, and I know exactly what kind of passengers belong here. This entire conversation is ridiculous, and I demand immediate resolution." Christopher felt his military composure crack slightly. Here was a woman berating him while he stood in the presence of genuine American royalty. Samuel Beckett wasn't just any veteran. He was a man whose actions had been so heroic, so selfless, that Congress had approved the nation's highest military decoration. The contrast between Samuel's quiet dignity and Isabella's braying entitlement couldn't have been starker. "Ma'am," Christopher said, his voice carrying a new edge of authority, "I'm going to need you to remain seated and quiet while I finish my investigation." He turned back to Samuel, his mind racing with the implications of what he discovered. "General, may I ask what you did to earn the medal?" Samuel's eyes grew distant, as if seeing across years and continents. "Convoy ambush outside Kandahar. My transport was hit. Several young airmen were trapped. I went back for them, multiple trips under heavy fire. Lost 3 good soldiers that day, but we saved 8. Christopher felt his throat tighten with emotion. The simple way Samuel described what was undoubtedly an act of extraordinary heroism spoke volumes about the man's character. While Isabella Frost had spent the last hour demanding special treatment based on her perceived status, Samuel Beckett had sat quietly, despite being one of the most genuinely distinguished passengers Christopher had ever encountered. Isabella's patience finally snapped completely. "That's it, Captain. Either you remove this man immediately, or I'm calling the airline president directly. I have his personal number, and I guarantee you that your career with this airline will be over by tomorrow morning. I don't care what tall tales he's spinning. I know his type, and they don't belong in first class." The phrase "his type" hit Christopher like a slap. Isabella Frost had just dismissed a Medal of Honor recipient, a man who had risked his life repeatedly for his country, as a type that didn't deserve respect. Christopher's anger, building steadily since he'd realized Samuel's true identity, finally reached a breaking point. "Ma'am, I'm going to stop you right there," Christopher said, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority as captain. "I need you to understand something very clearly. You are in the presence of genuine American military royalty, and your behavior has been completely inappropriate." Isabella's face showed confusion mixed with continued anger. "I don't know what lies he's told you, but I can assure you that people like him don't receive military honors. He's obviously taking advantage of your gullibility." Christopher felt something cold settle in his stomach. Isabella Frost's racism was so deep, so ingrained, that even when presented with evidence of Samuel's extraordinary service, she couldn't accept it. Her worldview couldn't accommodate the reality of a black man being a legitimate American hero. "General," Christopher said, turning back to Samuel, "I owe you a profound apology on behalf of this airline. And frankly, as an American citizen, the way you've been treated today is disgraceful." Samuel waved off the apology with characteristic grace. "Son, I've faced worse than angry passengers, but I appreciate your understanding." Christopher's mind was already working through how to address this situation appropriately. Isabella Frost had just spent an hour publicly humiliating one of America's most decorated veterans, and her behavior needed consequences. More importantly, Samuel Beckett deserved recognition and respect, not just from Christopher, but from every person in this cabin who had witnessed his mistreatment. The captain looked around the first-class cabin, noting the other passengers who had been watching the drama unfold. Some looked curious about the hushed conversation between Christopher and Samuel. Others, like elderly passenger Beatrice Nolan in her blue jacket, seemed to sense that something significant was happening. Victor Liang, the businessman in his green shirt, had been one of the few to show sympathy for Samuel earlier. Christopher realized that this was about more than just one passenger complaint. This was an opportunity to educate, to reveal truth, and to ensure that a genuine American hero received the respect he deserved. The other passengers needed to know who Samuel Beckett really was, and Isabella Frost needed to understand the magnitude of her error. "General," Christopher said quietly, "with your permission, I'd like to address the cabin about this situation. I think it's time everyone understood exactly who you are." Samuel studied the captain's face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "If you think it's appropriate, Captain. I've never been one to seek attention, but perhaps it might do some good." Christopher felt a grim satisfaction as he prepared to reveal the truth. Isabella Frost's arrogant assumptions were about to collide with reality in the most devastating way possible. Captain Christopher Vance stood in the center of the first-class aisle, his navy blue uniform commanding immediate attention under the bright overhead fluorescent lights. The silver stripes on his sleeves caught the natural light streaming through the cabin windows as he cleared his throat, preparing to address the passengers. The tension in the air was palpable, with every eye focused on him as he prepared to speak about the situation that had disrupted their flight. Isabella Frost straightened in her seat, her red silk blouse pristine as she adjusted her diamond necklace with confident fingers. A smug smile played across her lips as she assumed the captain was finally going to handle what she considered the problem passenger situation. She had been certain from the moment he arrived that another person in authority would see things her way. After all, she reasoned, people like her always received proper treatment from airline staff. Samuel Beckett remained seated quietly in his green polo shirt and dark slacks, maintaining the same dignified composure he had shown throughout the entire ordeal. His hands rested calmly on his armrests, though the other passengers could see the quiet strength in his bearing. The fluorescent lighting illuminated his face, showing no trace of anger or resentment, despite everything he had endured. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Christopher Vance began, his voice carrying the authority that came from years of military service and airline experience. "I need to address what has happened here today, and I believe it's important that everyone understands the full situation before we proceed with our flight." The businessman Victor Liang leaned forward in his seat, his orange dress shirt wrinkled from the tension of watching the confrontation unfold. He had been growing increasingly uncomfortable with Isabella Frost's behavior, and now he sensed that something significant was about to be revealed. The elderly passenger, Beatrice Nolan, distinguished in her blue jacket, clasped her hands together as she waited to hear what the captain had discovered. Flight attendant Samantha Howe stood near the galley, her face flushed with embarrassment over how she had initially handled the situation. She knew she had made mistakes in her response to Isabella Frost's demands, and now she waited anxiously to see how the captain would resolve the conflict. The bright cabin lighting seemed to highlight her discomfort as she realized the gravity of what had transpired. "I want you all to know," Captain Christopher Vance continued, his eyes moving across the assembled passengers, "that I've had the privilege of speaking with General Samuel Beckett, and I believe you should understand exactly who has been sitting among us today." Isabella Frost's smile widened, certain that the captain was about to validate her complaints. She had convinced herself that once the full investigation was complete, everyone would see that she had been right to question Samuel Beckett's presence in first class. Her diamond earrings caught the light as she nodded approvingly, preparing to accept what she assumed would be an apology for the inconvenience. But Captain Christopher Vance's next words shattered her expectations completely. "General Beckett is a retired Air Force general who served our country with distinction for over 30 years, the captain announced, his voice filled with unmistakable respect and admiration. "He is a recipient of the Medal of Honor, our nation's highest military decoration for valor in combat." The cabin fell into stunned silence. Passengers who had been whispering among themselves stopped mid-conversation, their expressions shifting from curiosity to shock. The magnitude of what the captain had just revealed began to sink in as they realized they were in the presence of genuine military heroism. Isabella Frost's confident expression faltered, her smile freezing on her face as the captain's words registered. The diamond necklace at her throat seemed to catch the light differently now, highlighting the sudden pallor of her skin. She had expected vindication, but instead she was hearing something that made her stomach drop with the realization of her terrible mistake. General Beckett earned his Medal of Honor during combat operations when he risked his own life to save members of his unit who were pinned down by enemy fire. Captain Christopher Vance continued, his military background evident in the respectful way he detailed the heroic actions. Under intense enemy bombardment, he made multiple trips into the danger zone to evacuate wounded soldiers, refusing to leave anyone behind. Samuel Beckett shifted slightly in his seat, clearly uncomfortable with the public attention being focused on his military service. His humility was evident as he tried to minimize his presence, but the captain continued sharing the details that painted a picture of extraordinary courage and selfless service. Victor Liang's mouth fell open as he processed the information, realizing that he had witnessed a decorated war hero being subjected to racist harassment. His orange shirt was damp with perspiration as he understood the full scope of Isabella Frost's error in judgment. The businessman in him recognized the catastrophic nature of her mistake, but the human being in him was simply appalled at the disrespect shown to someone who had sacrificed so much for their country. Elena Castillo, a passenger who had been quietly observing from her window seat, felt tears beginning to well up in her eyes. Her red blouse seemed to blur as emotion overcame her, recognizing in Samuel Beckett the same quiet strength and dignity that her late husband had possessed. As a veteran's widow, she understood the weight of the sacrifices that military families made, and seeing a Medal of Honor recipient treated with such disrespect struck her deeply. In addition to his combat heroism, Captain Christopher Vance continued, General Beckett spent his career training the next generation of military leaders and overseeing critical operations that kept our nation safe. His service record includes deployments to some of the most dangerous regions in the world, where he consistently demonstrated the values of courage, integrity, and selfless service that define the best of our military. Beatrice Nolan dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, her blue jacket trembling slightly as she was reminded of her own husband's military service decades earlier. Though he had never achieved such high rank or recognition, she understood the dedication required for a 30-year military career. The elderly woman felt ashamed that she had not spoken up earlier when Isabella Frost began her tirade. Isabella Frost sat frozen in her seat, her red silk blouse suddenly feeling too tight as the full weight of her actions became clear. The confident superiority she had felt just moments before was rapidly being replaced by a growing horror at what she had done. She had publicly humiliated a genuine American hero based on nothing more than racial prejudice and her own sense of entitlement. "I want everyone in this cabin to understand," Captain Christopher Vance said, his voice growing stronger, "that General Beckett has given more to this country than most of us could imagine. He has earned the right to sit wherever he chooses, not because of his rank or decorations, but because he is a human being deserving of dignity and respect." The passengers began to murmur among themselves, their voices filled with awe and respect as they looked at Samuel Beckett with new understanding. The businessman Victor Liang shook his head in disbelief, realizing that he had nearly witnessed one of America's heroes being removed from an airplane because of one woman's racist assumptions. Samantha Howe covered her face with her hands, overwhelmed by shame at how she had initially responded to Isabella Frost's demands. The flight attendant realized that her failure to stand up for what was right had contributed to the public humiliation of a Medal of Honor recipient. The bright cabin lighting seemed harsh now, illuminating her failure to recognize dignity and worth when it was right in front of her. General Beckett's leadership extended beyond the battlefield, the captain continued, determined that everyone understand the full scope of the man they were dealing with. He oversaw humanitarian missions, disaster relief operations, and international peacekeeping efforts. His strategic planning saved countless lives and helped maintain stability in regions torn by conflict. Elena Castillo wiped tears from her cheeks. Her red blouse darkened with emotion as she thought about the sacrifices that military families made. She knew that behind every decorated officer was a lifetime of service that often went unrecognized by civilians. Seeing Samuel Beckett maintain his dignity throughout Isabella Frost's attack reminded her of the quiet strength that characterized so many veterans. Isabella Frost's hands trembled slightly as she gripped the armrests of her seat, her diamond rings clicking against the metal fittings. The reality of her situation was beginning to penetrate her shock, and she realized that she had made a catastrophic error in judgment. Her mind raced as she tried to process how she could have been so wrong about Samuel Beckett. The medals and commendations that General Beckett has earned represent not just his individual heroism, but the sacrifice and dedication of all our service members, Captain Christopher Vance explained. When we disrespect our veterans, we dishonor the very freedoms they fought to protect. The captain's words hung in the air as passengers continued to absorb the magnitude of what they had witnessed. Several other travelers began turning in their seats to get a better look at Samuel Beckett, their expressions filled with newfound respect and admiration. The general himself remained composed, though clearly uncomfortable with being the center of attention. Victor Liang felt compelled to say something, his voice shaking slightly as he addressed the cabin. "General, sir, I want to apologize for not speaking up sooner. What happened here today was wrong, and you deserved better from all of us." Beatrice Nolan nodded emphatically, her blue jacket rustling as she turned to face Samuel Beckett. "My herald served in Vietnam," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "He would be ashamed of how you were treated today, General. We all should be." Isabella Frost remained silent, her face flushed with embarrassment and dawning comprehension of her mistake. Her red silk blouse seemed to stand out starkly against her pale skin as she realized that her assumptions had been not only wrong, but spectacularly, humiliatingly incorrect. The confidence that had driven her demands had evaporated completely. Elena Castillo stood up from her seat, her red blouse visible to the entire cabin, as she addressed Samuel Beckett directly. "General, my husband served for 22 years before he passed away last year. He always said that the real heroes were the ones who never talked about what they did. Thank you for your service, and I'm sorry for what you endured today." The emotional weight of the moment settled over the entire first-class cabin as passengers began to understand that they had witnessed something much more significant than a simple customer service dispute. They had seen racism and prejudice directed at someone whose life had been dedicated to serving and protecting the very ideals that made their freedom possible. Captain Christopher Vance looked directly at Isabella Frost, his expression stern as he prepared to address her role in the situation. "I think it's clear to everyone now that the assumptions made about General Beckett were not only inappropriate, but completely unfounded. This man has earned our respect through a lifetime of service and sacrifice." Isabella Frost's mouth opened and closed as she struggled to find words, but nothing came out. The smugness and certainty she had displayed earlier had been replaced by visible shock and the beginning recognition of just how badly she had misjudged the situation. Her diamond jewelry seemed gaudy now, rather than elegant, highlighting the superficiality of the values she had used to judge Samuel Beckett. The revelation had transformed the entire atmosphere of the cabin, turning what had been a source of division and controversy into a moment of unity and recognition. Passengers who had remained silent during Isabella Frost's initial tirade now felt compelled to express their support for Samuel Beckett and their shame at allowing the situation to progress as far as it had. As Captain Christopher Vance concluded his remarks about Samuel Beckett's distinguished service record, the full weight of Isabella Frost's error became undeniable to everyone present. The woman who had demanded the removal of a passenger based on racial prejudice had unknowingly targeted one of America's genuine heroes, creating a situation that would have consequences far beyond the confines of the aircraft cabin. The silence that followed Captain Christopher Vance's revelation hung heavy in the first-class cabin, broken only by the gentle hum of the aircraft's engines and the soft overhead lighting casting everything in crystal clarity. Isabella Frost stood frozen in the aisle, her red silk blouse now seeming garish against her suddenly pale complexion, her diamond jewelry catching the light as her hands trembled slightly. The weight of 30 pairs of eyes bore down on her as the magnitude of her mistake settled over the cabin like a suffocating blanket. Samuel Beckett remained seated with the same quiet dignity he had maintained throughout the ordeal, his green polo shirt and dark slacks a stark contrast to the opulence surrounding him. Yet somehow he now commanded more respect than anyone else in first class. His weathered hands rested calmly on his lap, and his eyes held no malice, only the patient strength of a man who had faced far worse than the petty prejudices of entitled strangers. Isabella Frost's mouth opened and closed several times before words finally emerged, her voice higher and more strained than before. "Well, how was I supposed to know?" she said, her tone defensive and shrill. "He never said anything about being in the military. If he's some kind of war hero, why didn't he just tell me from the beginning? This whole thing could have been avoided if he had simply identified himself properly." The audacity of her words sent a ripple of disgust through the cabin. Passengers who had been quietly observing the confrontation now shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some shaking their heads in disbelief. The natural skylight streaming through the aircraft windows seemed to illuminate every expression of revulsion and disappointment directed toward Isabella Frost. Victor Liang, the businessman in his orange dress shirt and navy blazer, who had been observing from 3 rows back, unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up. His voice carried clear authority as he addressed Isabella Frost directly. "Ma'am, with all due respect, what you're saying is completely inappropriate. No passenger should have to present their military credentials or justify their presence based on their race or appearance. Your assumptions were wrong from the moment you opened your mouth." Beatrice Nolan, the elderly passenger in her blue jacket, clutched her pearl necklace as tears welled up in her eyes. Her voice quavered with emotion as she spoke. "My Herald served 3 tours in Vietnam before he passed. He would roll over in his grave knowing how you treated this hero. Shame on you, young lady. Absolute shame on you." Isabella Frost's face flushed red as she looked around the cabin, searching for any sign of support or sympathy. Finding none, she turned her attention back to Captain Christopher Vance, her voice becoming more desperate. "Captain, surely you understand that this was just a misunderstanding. I'm a frequent flyer. I know how these things work. Sometimes people do try to sneak into first class, and I was just looking out for the airline's interests." Captain Christopher Vance's jaw tightened as he listened to Isabella Frost's continued excuses. His pilot's uniform with its pristine short sleeves and polished insignia seemed to radiate authority as he stepped closer to her. "Mrs. Frost, let me be absolutely clear about something. Your behavior today had nothing to do with protecting airline interests and everything to do with your own prejudices. No passenger should ever have to prove their worthiness to fly based on the color of their skin or your personal assumptions about who belongs where." The captain's words carried the weight of absolute moral authority, and several passengers nodded in agreement. A young mother holding her infant whispered, "Absolutely right," while an older gentleman in a business suit muttered, "About time someone said it." Samantha Howe, the flight attendant who had been caught in the middle of the confrontation, approached Samuel Beckett with tears streaming down her face. Her airline uniform was immaculate, but her composure was completely shattered. "General Beckett, I am so deeply sorry for how I handled this situation. I should have stood up to her demands from the beginning. There is no excuse for how I allowed you to be treated, and I take full responsibility for my part in this humiliation." Samuel Beckett looked up at the young flight attendant with kind eyes, his voice gentle but firm. "Miss Howe, I appreciate your apology, but don't carry this burden alone. We all face moments where we have to choose between what's easy and what's right. What matters is that we learn from these experiences and do better next time." Isabella Frost watched this exchange with growing frustration, her carefully constructed world of privilege and entitlement cracking around her. She had expected immediate vindication, perhaps even gratitude for her vigilance. Instead, she found herself cast as the villain in a story that was rapidly spinning out of her control. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, her voice growing louder and more abrasive. "I'm being treated like some kind of criminal for asking legitimate questions. If people would just dress appropriately and follow proper protocols, none of this would happen. I don't see why I should have to apologize for expecting certain standards to be maintained." Her words fell like stones into a still pond, creating ripples of shock and revulsion throughout the cabin. Elena Castillo, a passenger wearing a red cardigan who had been quietly crying since the revelation of Samuel Beckett's service, stood up and faced Isabella Frost directly. "Standards?" Elena's voice shook with emotion. "The only standard that matters here is basic human decency, which you've failed spectacularly. My husband died serving this country, and if someone had treated him the way you treated General Beckett, I would have made sure they faced consequences." Isabella Frost's eyes flashed with anger at being confronted by multiple passengers. "Don't you dare lecture me about standards and consequences. Do you know who I am? Do you know what kind of influence my family has? I don't have to stand here and be attacked by a bunch of people who don't understand how the world really works." The more Isabella Frost spoke, the deeper she dug herself into a hole of her own making. Passengers began pulling out their phones, some discreetly recording her continued outburst. The soft clicks and beeps of social media notifications started filling the air as videos began uploading to various platforms. "Are you seriously filming this?" Isabella Frost shrieked, noticing the phones pointed in her direction. "This is a private conversation. You can't just record people without permission." Victor Liang held his phone steady as he addressed her calmly. "Ma'am, your behavior in a public space is absolutely fair game for documentation, especially when it involves the harassment of a Medal of Honor recipient. The world needs to see exactly how you've conducted yourself today." Captain Christopher Vance observed the escalating situation with growing concern, not for Isabella Frost's reputation, but for the continued disruption to his other passengers and crew. "Mrs. Michael Dougherty Aide Frost, I strongly suggest you return to your seat and remain quiet for the remainder of this boarding process. Your continued outburst is disturbing other passengers and creating an unsafe environment." Isabella Frost whirled around to face him, her carefully styled hair now disheveled from her animated gesturing. "Unsafe environment? The only unsafe thing here is allowing people to attack paying customers who are simply trying to maintain civilized standards. I demand to speak to your supervisor immediately." "I am the supervisor on this aircraft," Captain Christopher Vance replied evenly, "and I'm telling you that your behavior constitutes passenger interference and potential discrimination. These are serious matters that airlines take very seriously, regardless of your perceived status or influence." The captain's words seemed to penetrate Isabella Frost's bubble of entitlement for the first time, and a flicker of genuine concern crossed her face. She looked around the cabin again, this time seeming to truly see the expressions of disgust and disappointment surrounding her. The reality of her situation began to dawn on her as she noticed more passengers documenting her behavior. "This isn't fair," she said, her voice taking on a whining quality that made her sound like a petulant child rather than the sophisticated socialite she pretended to be. "I was just trying to do what I thought was right. If he had been wearing a uniform or had some kind of identification visible, none of this would have happened." Beatrice Nolan's voice cut through Isabella Frost's excuses like a knife. "Honey, my Herald never wore his uniform when he traveled, and neither did any of his buddies. They served their country and earned the right to dress however they wanted in civilian life. Your problem wasn't with his clothes. It was with the color of his skin, and we all know it." The blunt honesty of the elderly woman's words seemed to strike Isabella Frost like a physical blow. Her mouth fell open, and for a moment she appeared genuinely speechless. But rather than acknowledge the truth of the accusation, she doubled down on her defensive posture. "How dare you accuse me of racism?" Isabella Frost said, her voice rising to near hysteria. "I have friends of all colors. I donate to charities. I'm not a racist. I'm just someone who believes in proper order and appropriate behavior. There's nothing wrong with expecting people to look the part if they want to be treated accordingly." The cabin erupted in a chorus of disgusted murmurs and head shaking. Several passengers called out responses. "That's exactly what racism sounds like," one voice said. "Unbelievable," said another. "She's actually making it worse," whispered a third. Samuel Beckett finally stood up from his seat, his presence immediately commanding attention and respect. Even at his full height, he radiated the quiet authority that came from decades of military leadership and service to his country. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute moral authority. "Mrs. Frost, I've served this country for over 30 years. I've led men and women of every background, color, and creed into combat situations where the only thing that mattered was character and courage. I've seen the best and worst of humanity, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that a person's worth has nothing to do with their appearance, their clothing, or your ability to immediately identify their accomplishments." Isabella Frost stared at him, her earlier bravado completely deflated in the face of his quiet dignity and moral clarity. For a moment, it seemed as though she might actually apologize or show some genuine remorse for her behavior. Instead, she crossed her arms defensively and lifted her chin in a gesture of defiant superiority. "Well, I still think you could have handled this better by being more forthcoming from the beginning." The collective gasp from the passengers was audible. Even after everything that had been revealed, everything that had been explained, Isabella Frost remained utterly incapable of accepting responsibility for her actions or acknowledging the harm she had caused. Captain Christopher Vance stepped forward, his face grave with the weight of command decision. "Mrs. Frost, I'm going to need you to gather your belongings. Based on your continued disruptive behavior and refusal to acknowledge the inappropriateness of your actions, I'm making the decision to remove you from this flight." Isabella Frost's face went white, then red, then white again as the full implications of the captain's words sank in. Around her, passengers continued recording, their phones capturing every moment of her public disgrace. The bright cabin lighting seemed to spotlight her humiliation as the consequences of her prejudice and entitlement finally began to manifest in real, tangible ways that her privilege and connections couldn't simply wave away. The backfire was complete, and Isabella Frost found herself trapped in a web of her own making, with nowhere to hide from the judgment of decent people who had witnessed her true character on full display. The fluorescent lights of the first-class cabin illuminated a scene that would soon transform from a localized incident into a nationwide conversation. As passengers continued documenting Isabella Frost's increasingly desperate attempts at damage control, the power of social media began its relentless work. Within minutes of the first video uploads, the hashtag Medal of Honor Shame began trending across multiple platforms. Russell Ford was reviewing quarterly reports in his corner office at airline headquarters when his assistant burst through the door with unusual urgency. The senior executive, wearing his characteristic orange dress shirt beneath a navy blazer, looked up from his papers as she thrust a tablet toward him, showing a viral video with over 50,000 views and climbing rapidly. "Sir, you need to see this immediately," she said, her voice tight with concern. "It's one of our flights, and it's exploding across social media." Russell Ford watched the video with growing horror as Isabella Frost's voice carried clearly through someone's smartphone recording. Her red silk blouse seemed to glow under the cabin lighting as she continued making increasingly damaging statements. Even after Samuel Beckett's heroic service had been revealed to everyone present, the executive's face darkened as he realized the magnitude of the crisis developing in real time. "Get me Captain Vance on the radio immediately," Russell Ford commanded, his fingers already flying across his phone screen as he pulled up the airline's crisis management protocols. "And contact our legal department. We have a situation that could destroy everything we've built." Meanwhile, aboard the aircraft, Isabella Frost finally seemed to grasp that her world was shifting beneath her feet. The constant clicking of camera phones and the disgusted murmurs of fellow passengers created a symphony of consequences she had never anticipated. Her diamond jewelry caught the overhead lighting as she fidgeted nervously, the weight of public scrutiny beginning to crush her entitled facade. Samuel Beckett remained seated with the same dignified composure he had maintained throughout the ordeal, his green polo shirt and dark slacks a stark contrast to Isabella Frost's increasingly frantic energy. He watched quietly as passenger after passenger approached to apologize for their initial silence and to express gratitude for his service to the country. Elena Castillo, whose husband had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before his death, stood beside Samuel Beckett with tears streaming down her face. "My Carlos always said the real heroes never talk about what they did," she said softly. "He would have been honored to shake your hand, sir." The emotional moment was interrupted by Isabella Frost's shrill voice cutting through the cabin. "This is ridiculous. I'm calling my lawyer right now. You people have no idea who you're dealing with." Victor Liang, the businessman who had witnessed the entire confrontation, looked up from his own phone with a grim expression. "Actually, Mrs. Frost, I think we're all finding out exactly who we're dealing with. Your husband's construction company just lost the Morrison Plaza contract. My firm was considering them as well, but not anymore." Isabella Frost's face went pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. "What are you talking about? That's impossible." "Social media works fast these days," Victor Liang replied, holding up his phone screen showing news articles already picking up the story. "Frost Construction's stock price is dropping in real time. Your husband's business partners are distancing themselves publicly." The reality of consequences began hitting Isabella Frost like successive waves. Her privileged world, built on connections and reputation, was crumbling with each shared video and news report. She grabbed her designer purse and stood abruptly, her red outfit now seeming garish under the unforgiving cabin lighting. Captain Christopher Vance received Russell Ford's urgent communication through his headset, and the conversation was brief but decisive. The airline would take immediate action to address the situation, starting with a comprehensive investigation and public apology. More importantly, Samuel Beckett would receive the treatment he deserved as both a valued customer and an American hero. "General Beckett," Captain Christopher Vance said, approaching with renewed purpose, "I've just spoken with our executive leadership. The airline would like to offer you our sincerest apologies and full compensation for this inexcusable treatment. Additionally, you'll be upgraded to our premium service for any future travel, permanently." Samuel Beckett nodded graciously, his military bearing evident in every gesture. "I appreciate that, Captain, but what I'd really like to see is training for your staff about treating all passengers with dignity, regardless of how they look or where they come from." The captain's respect for Samuel Beckett deepened further. Even in vindication, the general was thinking about systemic improvement rather than personal gain. "That will absolutely happen, sir. You have my word." Isabella Frost's phone buzzed incessantly with calls from her husband, her social circle, and numbers she didn't recognize. Each notification seemed to drain more color from her face as the scope of her public disgrace became clear. The comfortable bubble of privilege that had protected her from consequences throughout her life was bursting spectacularly. Lieutenant Colonel Heather Cross was reviewing personnel files at the Pentagon when a colleague alerted her to the viral story involving a Medal of Honor recipient. Within moments of confirming Samuel Beckett's identity, she was on the phone with airline executives, military affairs offices, and media relations departments. The Pentagon took care of its heroes, active or retired. This is completely unacceptable treatment of one of our nation's finest, Lieutenant Colonel Heather Cross stated firmly during her call to Russell Ford. General Beckett saved 17 soldiers under enemy fire and served this country with distinction for 32 years. He deserves better than this disgrace. Russell Ford assured her that the airline was taking immediate action, but Lieutenant Colonel Heather Cross was already coordinating a broader response. Military advocacy groups, veteran organizations, and congressional offices were being briefed on the situation. Samuel Beckett would receive the recognition and respect he had always deserved. Back in the cabin, Isabella Frost made her decision to escape the increasingly hostile environment. She pushed past other passengers toward the exit, her heels clicking frantically against the aircraft floor. But her path was blocked by Samantha Howe, who had found her backbone after witnessing the complete transformation of the situation. "Ma'am, I need you to return to your seat," Samantha Howe said firmly, her flight attendant uniform crisp under the bright lighting. "We're preparing for departure, and you cannot leave the aircraft at this time." "Get out of my way," Isabella Frost snapped, her composure completely shattered. "I demand to be let off this plane immediately. I won't be trapped here with these people." Her outburst was captured by multiple cameras, adding another damaging clip to the growing collection of evidence documenting her behavior. The other passengers reacted with audible disgust at her continued display of entitlement and prejudice. Douglas Ramsey, the airport security chief, had been monitoring the situation from the gate area as social media reports flooded his department's attention. A veteran himself, he felt personal outrage at Isabella Frost's treatment of a Medal of Honor recipient. When she finally emerged from the aircraft, she found herself facing not just airport security, but a growing crowd of passengers from other flights who had seen the videos online. "There she is," someone called out, pointing at Isabella Frost's distinctive red outfit. "That's the woman who attacked the war hero." Isabella Frost found herself surrounded by a sea of disapproving faces, their smartphones recording her every move. Douglas Ramsey stepped forward, his security uniform authoritative under the terminal's fluorescent lighting. His muscular frame and professional demeanor commanded immediate attention. "Ma'am, I need you to come with me," Douglas Ramsey said calmly but firmly. "We have some questions about the incident aboard the aircraft." "This is harassment," Isabella Frost protested, but her voice lacked its earlier conviction. The reality of facing real consequences was overwhelming her entitled worldview. "I haven't done anything wrong." The crowd's reaction was immediate and harsh. Passengers who had seen the videos online began calling out her behavior, describing her actions towards Samuel Beckett in detail. Isabella Frost realized that her face was now recognizable to strangers, her reputation permanently damaged by her own choices. Meanwhile, Samuel Beckett remained aboard the aircraft, surrounded by genuine respect and admiration from fellow passengers. Beatrice Nolan, an elderly woman in her blue jacket, approached with trembling hands to thank him for his service. Her husband had served in Vietnam, and she understood the sacrifices military families made. "Young man," she said, her voice shaky with emotion, "my Robert would have been proud to serve alongside someone like you. Thank you for everything you've done for our country." The scene inside the cabin had transformed completely from the earlier confrontation. Where once there had been tension and division, now there was unity and shared purpose. Passengers who had initially remained silent were now vocal in their support for Samuel Beckett and their condemnation of Isabella Frost's behavior. Captain Christopher Vance made an announcement over the intercom that would be recorded and shared thousands of times. "Ladies and gentlemen, today we have been privileged to travel with a genuine American hero. General Samuel Beckett's service to our nation exemplifies the very best of our military tradition. It is an honor to have him aboard our aircraft." The applause that followed was spontaneous and sustained, filling the cabin with genuine appreciation for Samuel Beckett's sacrifice and service. Several passengers wiped away tears as they contemplated the injustice he had endured and the grace with which he had handled the situation. Outside the aircraft, Isabella Frost's world continued its spectacular collapse. Her husband's business was hemorrhaging clients by the hour. Her social media accounts were flooded with criticism, and news outlets were picking up the story with increasing frequency. The woman who had demanded Samuel Beckett's removal based on his appearance was now facing the full consequences of her prejudice and entitlement. Russell Ford arrived at the airport personally to meet with Samuel Beckett, bringing with him a team of executives and public relations specialists. The airline's response would be swift, comprehensive, and designed to demonstrate their commitment to treating all passengers with dignity and respect. As Isabella Frost was escorted away by airport security, her red outfit now wrinkled and her composure completely shattered, the passengers remaining in the terminal continued documenting and discussing the incident. The viral nature of social media had transformed a single act of prejudice into a national conversation about respect, dignity, and the true meaning of heroism. Samuel Beckett's quiet dignity throughout the ordeal had not only vindicated his own character, but had also inspired others to examine their own assumptions and biases. The consequences facing Isabella Frost were not just personal, but symbolic, representing society's rejection of the entitled prejudice she had displayed. The fluorescent lights of the terminal continued to illuminate a scene that would be remembered long after the flights departed. Justice was beginning to manifest through consequences, accountability was being demanded, and support systems were rallying around a true American hero. Isabella Frost's entitled world was crumbling, one viral video at a time, while Samuel Beckett's dignity remained unshakable, inspiring hope for positive change in an increasingly connected world. The morning sunlight streaming through the aircraft windows seemed brighter now, illuminating what had become a scene of profound transformation. Samuel Beckett sat in his green polo shirt and dark slacks, no longer the target of scorn, but the recipient of genuine reverence from everyone around him. The same first-class cabin that had witnessed his humiliation now buzzed with activity as airline personnel worked to rectify the injustice he had endured. Captain Christopher Vance approached Samuel's seat with purposeful strides, his pilot's uniform crisp under the fluorescent cabin lighting. Behind him followed Russell Ford, the airline executive who had arrived within an hour of the incident going viral. Ford wore an orange dress shirt beneath his blue jacket, his expression serious yet respectful as he prepared to address the man his airline had failed. "General Beckett," Russell Ford began, his voice carrying throughout the quiet cabin, "on behalf of the entire airline, I want to offer you our most sincere apologies for what transpired here today. What you experienced is absolutely unacceptable and goes against everything we stand for as a company." Samuel looked up from his seat with the same quiet dignity he had maintained throughout the ordeal. Other passengers leaned forward to hear his response, many still processing the revelation of his true identity and service record. "I appreciate your words, Mr. Ford," Samuel replied, his voice steady and measured. "But I want to be clear about something. I didn't deserve better treatment because I'm a general or because I have medals. I deserve better treatment because I'm a human being, just like every other passenger on this aircraft." The wisdom in his words settled over the cabin like a gentle revelation. Elena Castillo, the veteran's widow in her red blouse, wiped tears from her eyes as she nodded in agreement. Victor Liang, the businessman who had witnessed the entire confrontation, shook his head in amazement at Samuel's grace under pressure. Russell Ford cleared his throat, clearly moved by Samuel's response. "You're absolutely right, sir, and that's exactly why we're taking comprehensive action. We're implementing immediate changes to our training protocols and policies to ensure this never happens again. Meanwhile, at the back of first class, Isabella Frost sat isolated in her red silk blouse, her diamond jewelry catching the light as she hunched over her phone. The social media storm surrounding her behavior had reached hurricane proportions. Videos of her racist demands and subsequent meltdown had been shared thousands of times across multiple platforms. Her phone buzzed incessantly with notifications, each one bringing news of another consequence for her actions. Her husband's business partners had already begun distancing themselves from the Frost family brand. 3 major clients had canceled contracts within hours of the videos surfacing, citing incompatible values and public relations concerns. The woman who had wielded her social status like a weapon now watched helplessly as that very status crumbled around her. Samantha Howe, the flight attendant who had initially complied with Isabella's demands, approached Samuel's seat with visible remorse. Her uniform was perfectly pressed, but her expression carried the weight of regret for her earlier actions. "General Beckett," she said softly, "I owe you a personal apology. I failed you today when I should have stood up for what was right. I let intimidation and pressure cloud my judgment, and I'm deeply sorry." Samuel looked up at her with understanding eyes. "Miss Howe, you were put in an impossible situation. The system failed both of us today. What matters now is what we learn from this experience and how we ensure it doesn't happen to someone else." His compassion toward someone who had initially sided against him left several passengers in awe. Beatrice Nolan, the elderly passenger in her blue jacket, spoke up from across the aisle. "Young man," she said, addressing Samuel with the familiarity that came with age and wisdom, "my herald served in Vietnam. He would have been honored to shake your hand. Thank you for your service, and thank you for showing us how a real hero handles adversity." Other passengers began expressing similar sentiments. A chorus of gratitude and apologies filled the cabin as people who had remained silent during the initial confrontation found their voices. The businessman Victor Liang stood up from his seat, his orange shirt visible beneath his blue jacket. "I need to say something," Victor announced, addressing the entire cabin. "I witnessed this entire situation unfold, and I'm ashamed that I didn't speak up immediately. We all have a responsibility to stand against injustice when we see it, regardless of who's involved." His words sparked a broader conversation about bystander responsibility and moral courage. Passengers shared their own experiences with discrimination and discussed how they could do better in the future. The cabin had transformed into an impromptu classroom on human dignity and social responsibility. Captain Christopher Vance, who had been coordinating with ground staff, returned to update Samuel on the arrangements being made. "General, we've prepared the VIP lounge for you during your layover, and you'll have priority boarding and our finest accommodations for the remainder of your journey. Additionally, the airline would like to invite you to speak at our upcoming diversity and inclusion training sessions." Samuel considered the offer thoughtfully. "I'd be honored to participate, Captain, but I'd want to focus not just on what went wrong today, but on how we can build understanding and respect across all communities." As news of the incident continued to spread, Samuel's phone began ringing with calls from media outlets, veteran organizations, and community groups. Lieutenant Colonel Heather Cross from the Pentagon had reached out personally to offer support and resources. The story had grown beyond a simple airline incident into a national conversation about respect, service, and the assumptions we make about others. Isabella Frost attempted to gather her belongings and leave the aircraft quietly, but the damage to her reputation was irreversible. Airport security personnel, led by Douglas Ramsey, were waiting to escort her through the terminal as crowds of travelers had gathered to express their disapproval of her behavior. The entitled woman, who had demanded special treatment, now found herself universally condemned for her actions. As she passed Samuel's seat one final time, Isabella made a last desperate attempt to salvage some dignity. "I hope you understand that I never meant any real harm," she said quietly. Avoiding eye contact, Samuel looked up at her with the same steady gaze he had maintained throughout the confrontation. "Ma'am, intent doesn't erase impact, but I do hope you learn from this experience and use it to become a better person." Even in his moment of vindication, Samuel offered grace to the woman who had tried to humiliate him. His response demonstrated the character that had earned him the Medal of Honor and the respect of everyone who truly knew him. As the flight prepared for departure, the atmosphere in first class had completely transformed. What began as a scene of division and hostility had become a community of understanding and mutual respect. Passengers who had been strangers now engaged in meaningful conversations about service, sacrifice, and the importance of treating all people with dignity. Russell Ford made one final announcement to the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, today we witnessed both the worst and the best of humanity. We saw how prejudice and entitlement can hurt innocent people, but we also saw how truth, courage, and character ultimately prevail. General Beckett has shown us what real strength looks like, and I hope we all carry that lesson forward." The passengers erupted in spontaneous applause, a standing ovation for a man who had faced humiliation with dignity and vindication with grace. Samuel stood briefly to acknowledge their recognition, but his expression remained humble and thoughtful. As the aircraft pushed back from the gate, Samuel gazed out the window at the airport below. The incident that had begun with such pain and injustice had evolved into something more meaningful. It had become a teaching moment, a catalyst for important conversations, and a reminder that heroism comes in many forms. The social media storm continued to rage around Isabella Frost, but it had also elevated Samuel's story and message. Veterans organizations shared his example of dignity under fire. Diversity advocates used the incident to highlight ongoing challenges and the importance of speaking up against discrimination. Business leaders discussed the swift consequences faced by the Frost family as an example of how actions have real-world impacts. Captain Christopher Vance made a final visit to Samuel's seat before takeoff. "General, I want you to know that this incident has already sparked policy changes throughout our airline. Your example today will help protect future passengers from experiencing what you went through." Samuel nodded thoughtfully. "That's the only vindication I need, Captain. If my experience prevents someone else from facing this kind of treatment, then something good came from something bad." As the aircraft climbed into the bright morning sky, Samuel reflected on the morning's events. He had boarded the plane as an anonymous passenger and had faced public humiliation based solely on racist assumptions, but he was leaving as a recognized hero whose story would inspire others and drive meaningful change. The vindication was complete, but it wasn't about his personal triumph over adversity. It was about the community that had formed around shared values of respect and dignity. It was about the airline employees who had learned important lessons about standing up for what's right. It was about passengers who had found their voices and committed to speaking up against injustice in the future. Isabella Frost's fall from grace served as a stark reminder that privilege and status couldn't protect someone from the consequences of their actions in an age of social media and instant accountability. Her story would serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of prejudice and entitlement. But Samuel Beckett's story would serve as inspiration, a reminder that true heroism isn't just about battlefield courage, but about how we respond to injustice with dignity, how we treat others with grace even when they don't deserve it, and how we use our experiences to lift others up rather than tear them down. The morning sun continued to shine through the aircraft windows as they flew toward their destination, illuminating a cabin full of passengers who had witnessed something extraordinary. They had seen prejudice confronted by truth, hatred overcome by grace, and injustice transformed into a powerful lesson about human dignity and respect. You just heard a story that history tried to overlook. If it stayed with you, take a second to stand with it. Subscribe, share, and help us keep telling the stories that deserve light, not silence.